Okay. Happy Friday, everyone. I'm glad you could join us tonight on this beautiful Friday evening. We will be discussing emergency rental assistance program in depth tonight so that everyone can be equipped to get this money that the state is providing. We encourage everyone to apply, and here to give more insight on ERAP is Jack Newton, Director of the Public Benefits and LGBTQ advocacy units at the Bronx Legal Services. He will be giving a presentation tonight. We're so happy to have him and that he could join us. So Robert, could you put up his slides, please?
Certainly.
And Jack, yeah, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm excited to be here on this beautiful Friday evening. I know that question and answers are going to be open throughout this presentation. I believe we're holding them till the end, but I look forward to hearing all of your different questions and hope that this presentation helps you. So my name is Jack, and I'm from Bronx Legal Services, which is a civil legal services organization located in the Bronx that provides free civil legal services to residents of the Bronx across a variety of different issues. Next slide. So there are really three things we're going to do here today. First, I'm going to give you a broad overview of eligibility for the Emergency Rental Assistance Program. And then second, we're going to talk somewhat in depth about the application process for the program, primarily through the online portal that the state has set up. And then finally, I'll take some questions and answer them. Next slide. So ERAP, the website to apply for ERAP is on the screen right now. But you can certainly Google it, but it is otda.ny.gov. And the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, or ERAP, was funded by federal legislation late in 2020, and it provided a block grant to a bunch of different states, and then the states then decided how to apportion the money within their states. So New York State received this money from the federal government, and the New York State is going to be the ones making the decision on applications throughout New York City and through most of the state. So the New York State agency that will be handling this is called the New York State Office of Temporary and Disability Assistance, which I will refer to as OTDA. So the New York City Human Resources Administration doesn't play any role in these ERAP applications. They don't decide them, they don't look at them, they don't deny them, nothing. All of these applications will go to the state OTDA agencies. And the great news about ERAP is that eligible households, and we'll talk about eligibility in a second, will receive up to 12 months worth of rent arrears and up to 12 months of utility arrears like Con Ed. And some families will also receive a maximum of 3 months towards future rent. So it's not just the 12 months of arrears, but a possibility for 3 more months owed in the future. Next slide. I think you skipped a slide. So there is no immigration status requirement for ERAP. I think that's critical to understand. Everyone, there is no immigration status requirement of any kind at all. You don't have to be a citizen, you don't have to have a green card, you can have any status, or you could not have an eligible immigration status, and you would still be fine for ERAP. While the application will ask for social security numbers, you only have to provide one if you have one. So don't think that because it asks for a social security number that it will bar you. It's just you have to provide one if you have one. And unlike many one-shot deals, with ERAP, you do not have to pay it back. It is purely a grant. The grant will go directly to the landlord or to the utility provider, usually Con Ed, for the utility arrears. And critically, you cannot be evicted for non-payment of rent or for having an expired lease if you have an ERAP application that is pending with the state. I will repeat. If you have an ERAP application pending, then your landlord cannot evict you. If they start a housing case against you, it must be stopped, or what is called stayed, until the state reaches the decision on your ERAP application. Next. So these are the eligibility essentials for ERAP, and I'll talk about each one of these separately in a second. I know there's so much information, and I know people are anxious to get to their questions, and I hope to get to all of them. If you can take one thing away from today, I would like you to take away that you're probably eligible for ERAP if your income is below 80% of the area median income, which I'll talk about in a second. But these are the eligibility requirements for ERAP. You have to be a tenant or a primary occupant in New York State. You have to be obligated to pay rent at that primary residence. You have to owe back rent or rent arrears that have accrued on or since March 13th, 2020. You have to be a household at risk of experiencing homelessness or housing instability. And this is the one that people get the most worried about. And as I'll explain in a bit, don't be so worried about it. You're probably going to be eligible under this rule. But the rule is that on or since March 13th, 2020, a member of the household has qualified for or received unemployment insurance benefits, or you've experienced a decrease in income, you've experienced or had higher costs, or you've experienced some financial hardship, either directly or indirectly, all due to COVID-19. And then finally, the household's gross or total income has to be below 80% of the area median income. So next slide. First, we'll look at tenant or primary occupant in New York State. So it's pretty easy. You have to be a tenant. You can't own your apartment. So no homeowners, no co-op owners, etc. I get a lot of questions about HDFCs or Housing Development Fund corporations, which are a type of low-income cooperative that are dotted throughout the city, particularly in Harlem. And if many people rent an apartment in an HDFC, but many people are the owner of an HDFC. If you're an owner of an HDFC, you're probably paying maintenance. And if that's the case, you're not eligible for ERAP. But you can, again, you can rent in a co-op, you can rent a condo. In that case, you'd be eligible. You can also be a subtenant or a sublessee. So if you're renting the apartment from somebody, from your mother who doesn't live there, for example, and you're just the sublessee, you would also qualify. Next slide. So you have to be obligated to pay rent. So it's not that deep of a requirement, but for example, a 3-year-old is usually not obligated to pay the rent. So a 3-year-old can't apply. You're going to have to prove the obligation generally through a lease or something else. But you just have to owe the rent to the landlord. And during the landlord verification, they're going to have to provide some proof that you've paid rent in the past to them. Next slide. So you have to owe rent that has accrued since or on March 13th, 2020. So people really want to remember the March 13th, 2020, which is technically the rule. But in most cases, it's probably going to be April 1st, 2020 is when you first started owing rent, because most people pay rent once a month, or are supposed to pay rent once a month. And most people's rent is due on the 1st of the month. So if you owe March rent because it came due on March 1st, 2020, that wouldn't count. But everything on April 1, 2020 and later would count. You can also owe rent before this date. It's certainly not required that you only owe rent after March 13th, 2020, but ERAP only pays rent up beyond that date. It doesn't pay anything before that date. Next slide. So the household has to be at risk for eviction or housing unstable, which is sort of a technical term. But it's not really much of a hurdle here because anyone who owes rent to their landlord is considered at risk for eviction. So you necessarily have to be eligible for this because in order to get ERAP, you have to owe rent to the landlord. So essentially everybody would meet this definition. Next. So again, this is the one that people get worried about what they have to prove, what exactly it means. Did I get unemployment? Did I not get unemployment? But in making the decision that you had to experience financial hardship due to COVID-19, the New York State legislature purposefully gave it a very broad meaning. So there are different ways you can qualify for this. And I have not yet met one person that I've talked to about this, and I've talked to a lot of people about this, who didn't meet this criterion. So give it a lot of thought when you're thinking about it. And if you're thinking about pressing no, please talk to a provider or a community-based organization for help, because virtually everyone should be eligible. So certainly if you have received unemployment since March 13th, 2020, you're automatically eligible under this provision. It's defined that way, it's automatic. It's also automatic if you just qualified for unemployment during the same time period. The other way is that you had reduced income due to COVID-19. So that can look like a variety of different things, right? It could be your hours were shortened. It could be that your business closed for some or all of that time period. Your employer could have said, everyone has to take a 5% pay cut across the board. It could have been furlough days, which is when the employer says, we can't pay you 5 days a week, but we can pay you for 4 days a week. Anybody in those circumstances who had a decrease in income due to COVID-19 would qualify. If you had to take sick time as a result of caring for somebody and you weren't paid for that sick time, that would also count. So it's a pretty wide view of what reduced income means. You don't have to have had a decrease in hours for 12 months straight. If you had this decrease in income since March 13th, 2020 at some point and as a result of COVID, then that's it. You don't have to prove that you're still suffering now or that it lasted, a long time or that it was a significant amount of money. The other way you can prove it is having an increase in costs due to COVID-19. And this is where virtually everyone should be able to find something. So if your cost of essential items increased, that's an increased cost. So the price of food has gone up virtually across the board in New York City, at bodegas, at grocery stores, through online, all of it. So it would be pretty hard for me to find somebody whose food costs haven't increased as a result. Clothes and other necessities, anything that's increased in cost as a result of COVID would make you eligible. Same with increased transportation costs. Who hasn't taken a car service at some time in the past year, right? When you may ordinarily have taken a subway or a bus. That's an increased transportation cost, right? Because you didn't want to take the subway due to COVID. If you had to buy a mask, if you had to buy any sort of personal protective equipment, that's also an increased cost. Now, there are other costs that also are increased costs that are tied more closely to COVID, like if your healthcare costs went up due to caring for COVID, but that can also include having to buy Tylenol because your husband had COVID at some point and he had really high fevers. He didn't have to get hospitalized or anything like that, but certainly hospitalization costs and all the other medical costs would also make you eligible. And then the final thing is sort of written broadly to say that you experience financial hardship either directly or indirectly due to COVID-19. So really, I would stress that almost everybody is going to be able to prove this test and not to be so nervous about the exacting requirements for it. Next slide. So your gross income has to be at or below 80% of what's called the area median income. And this is a number the federal government calculates every year. And there's one for the New York City metropolitan area. I'll show you what the numbers are on the next slide. And gross income includes income from all sources, except certain things are excluded. But generally speaking, it's income from any source, child support, things like that. And to prove your income, you have two options. You can either show your previous month's income, meaning proof of income from everybody in your household over the age of 18 for the previous month, or you can use your income as reported on your 2020 tax return. So people ask me, what if my income has changed now, right? So use whichever one gets you eligible, because either one makes you eligible. If you have your 2020 tax return, it's somewhat easier to prove because you just have to give the tax document, but you can prove either. Next slide. So these are the actual dollar amounts. As you'll see, 80% of area median income is pretty high. So a household of 3 has to make under almost $86,000 a year. That's a substantial income. So the income requirement is not all that difficult to meet for many, many New Yorkers. Next slide. So those are the essential eligibility. Now we're going to talk about how to apply for it. Next. So the application's only available on OTDA's website. That's it. There's no other place on earth. There's no such thing as a paper application. You have to do it online. The only possible alternative is for people to apply by phone through a provider or through OTDA to complete the application, but all those people are just completing the application online. And unfortunately, as of today, there is currently no resume function. So for the first day and a half or so of this process on June 1 and half of June 2nd, you were able to start an application and save it and then go back to it. But due to problems on OTDA's website, or I don't know what, that feature dropped off, and they're working on restoring it. But it's been, a couple of weeks now already, and it still hasn't been restored. So right now you cannot return or resume an application. Next slide. The other thing to know is that we don't know about outcomes right now. I don't know when they're going to make a decision on cases. No case has been decided to my knowledge at this point. If I had to guess, OTDA is probably not going to make a decision for the first 30 days or so of the program, because the first 30 days has a different priority grouping where they have to pull people from certain categories. So if I had to guess, they're going to look at the whole universe of people for that first month and then go through it. But I don't know, maybe they're issuing approvals right now. They haven't said, but they keep telling us that it's going to be fast, whatever that means. Next slide. So this is what the online portal for ERAP looks like. If you go to it, this is what it will look like. And if you scroll down the screen, you'll see where it says to apply once you hit this page, but this is what the page looks like. Next. So you have 4 ways you can apply for ERAP. You can do it on your own. You can go to the website and you can do it on your own. After you hit submit, you can still get help from a community-based organization, or at any point post-application if problems arise, right? If you don't have a specific document and you need help, or you don't understand a document that you need, you can get help. You can call the state directly at the phone number on your screen, which is 844-NY1-RENT, R-E-N-T. So you can call the state and submit application by phone there, although they're generally limiting that particular service to people who cannot otherwise get help, including people with visual impairments. The other thing you can do is you can contact one of the community-based organizations that were selected by New York City's Human Resource Administration to provide application assistance. And there are at least 2 providers in every borough that are contracted to help people file applications, except in Staten Island where there's 1 person. And you can check HRA's website to find those different providers, or you can call 311. Jakari, did you have something you needed to say?
Well, I want to say that,
Mhm.
well, Robert, I think Robert was
Yeah, just to welcome all those who are just arriving, and to remind everyone that you have access to a Spanish channel if you would like to listen in Spanish, and just by tapping on the three dots on the bottom corner of your smartphone, and then choosing language interpretation, and then Spanish or English, and then done. Para escuchar en español, a través de los tres puntos, tocando el vidrio, el cristal de la pantalla, pueden acceder a través de los tres puntos a language interpretation, y después escogiendo Spanish, y por último, done. Thank you.
And actually at Pallante, we are helping people with the applications. So you can call us at 212-491-2541. If you need any assistance filling it out, we are scheduling appointments like every day. So yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
You can also, so going through a community-based organization is an extremely popular choice, and not everyone will be able to get an appointment as soon as they would like, in my experience. So that's certainly a great option, but people should absolutely apply on their own if they're able to do so. And you can go through, you can ask a friend or somebody else to help you fill out the application as well. It doesn't have to necessarily be one of the providers that HRA has picked in order to do it. Next slide. So because the stupid website isn't working well right now, you've got one chance right now and one shot to submit the application, meaning you have one sitting in which to complete the application, because you can't save it right now until they fix it. So my recommendation, particularly now, although I think in general in doing this application, before you call Pallante, before you call anybody, before you sit down with the application yourself, gather these documents or this information prior. Your current lease or your most recent expired lease. So people who don't have a current lease, your most recent expired lease, perfectly fine. A current rent breakdown from the landlord, right? I realize they're not always the most accurate document, but they're very helpful in completing the application itself, as I'll show you. If you owe utility arrears and you're seeking utility arrears, I would very much so recommend you ask Con Ed to send you a summary bill statement, which is free. And it lists many months of your Con Ed payment history. And then I would also gather the names, dates of birth, and social security numbers of every member of your household. Again, if you don't have a social security number, then you don't have to provide it. And then critically, this isn't getting started, but I don't think I can remind people too much. After you press submit, write down that application number. That application number is gold for you, because that plus the date of birth will provide you with updates on your application. If your landlord sues you for non-payment, you can show that you have an application pending, which should stop that case against you. So knowing the application number is really important. Next slide. So particularly when the resume application or saving application is fixed, but even now, I'd recommend register now as opposed to apply here now. These are the two options when you get to the website about how to apply for ERAP. The thing with register now is that you have to have an email address. I realize not everyone has an email address, and not everyone has an email address that they use. But it's critical if you're going to do register now that you have not just an email address, but one that you can access. Because after you log in for it, they're going to send a verification to your email. And you have to complete that verification before you can move on with the application. But registering makes it easier in the event that, OTDA loses the application or says you never applied or whatever, because even if you don't have an application number, you would have some registration available in the system that you created an account and that there was some activity there. You also will have to include a phone number that can receive text messages, and the website will send a hit to your phone verifying the phone number as well. Next slide. So really get the number. There's lots of different places where the application number will show up, and one of them is at the top of the page. This will be more evident when they fix the save your application along the way, but that is one of the locations you can find it after you submit it. Next slide. So during the application, it asks you for your lease terms, and some people are confused about what that means. So that's why having your current lease or your most recent lease is your best friend, because that'll help make this section easier. When did your lease begin is when your current lease began. If you don't have a current lease, then I would pick the last date you had a lease. And your monthly rental amount is whatever you're paying in rent. If you have weekly rent due, then you have to convert it to a monthly payment. Then you have to give them your type of house or apartment and how many bedrooms you have. So much of this is for information collecting on their part, but you still have to complete this accurately to the best of your knowledge. And you'll see the answers here include rent controlled, rent regulated, Mitchell-Lama, Section 8, public housing, other subsidy, or not applicable. Next slide. So let me start with not applicable. It's a perfectly fine option for you to pick not applicable. If you don't live in NYCHA, if you don't have Section 8, and you don't know what your housing is, pick not applicable. You don't have to have studied rent regulation law in New York City in order to answer this ERAP application. And I'm not entirely sure why they made all of these questions mandatory, but they did. If you live in Section 8 or you live in public housing, which is NYCHA, then you do need to answer the question yes to those two things. It asks if you're rent controlled or rent regulated. So if you're rent controlled, you probably know it because there are only a few 10,000 rent controlled apartments left in the entire city. And you had to have essentially continuously occupied your apartment since June 1st, 1971. So people who are rent controlled tend to know that they're rent controlled. Most of the other regulation in the city is called rent stabilized, which is a form of rent regulation. So you may be rent stabilized or rent regulated if your landlord gives you a choice between a 1-year and a 2-year lease every time. You may be rent stabilized if your rent increase is a different percentage every 1 or 2 years. It could be 1% for a 1-year lease and 1.5% for your 2-year lease, for example. You may be rent regulated or rent stabilized if you've lived in your apartment for more than 10 years. You're probably rent regulated as well. I'll say something about Section 8 or public housing. So you're eligible for ERAP if you live in Section 8 or public housing. It's not an eligibility thing. However, people who are seeking arrears who live in Section 8 or in public house and live in NYCHA will be the lowest priority to get the grants approved. So the way that the legislation is written is that people who live in that kind of subsidized housing, which is hundreds of thousands of humans, nevertheless, people who live in Section 8 or NYCHA are on the lowest priority. So only after all other eligible populations receive an ERAP grant can the state start to give out ERAP grants to people who participate in Section 8 or who live in NYCHA. And that doesn't mean you'll necessarily be denied, but it does mean that it will take a long time to decide your application. Now, that should also mean that your application may be pending for a long time. And if as long as it's not denied, you would remain, your landlord can evict you for non-payment of rent. Next slide. So the reason why it's good to have a rent breakdown that you can see, or some sort of rent history, even if you've created it, is this screen. So when you're going through the application, you can't just say, I owe $21,000. No, that would be far too easy. Instead, the state requires you to put in how much rent was due in every particular month, how much you haven't paid, which would be the amount past due, and any late or other fees. It could be illegal fees, it could be the air conditioning fees, whatever it is. And those go into different columns. So having a rent breakdown in front of you will make it easier to fill out this particular screen, which can be pretty time consuming, but there's no way around it, and a rent breakdown can help. Next slide. So utility arrears are also complicated to enter in the same way. So they separate out gas from electric. Many people in New York City have a consolidated bill, like most Manhattan residents, for example, myself included. You just get Con Ed, right? And the gas service goes through Con Ed if you have gas service. But for some people, it's bifurcated. It's also not Con Ed for everybody, but it's largely Con Ed in the city for utilities. You're going to need your account number. You're going to need the name of the person on the bill. And you're going to need to identify who the person is on the bill if it's not you. And then, and this is the unpleasant part, or one of the unpleasant parts, is that you have to go month by month to explain what the Con Ed bill was for that month, how much you still owe from that month, and you have to go month by month by month. And the reason why I suggest that you call Con Ed and get a summary statement bill sent to you, which they can do the same day, is because it lists it lists it out by month. It gives the amount of your bill for each of those months. It gives what you paid for that month, and it gives what you owe for that month. And it makes this section much, much easier to complete. Next slide. At the end, you can, as you're about to submit your application, you can request how you receive notices about the status of your application. And you can pick any of these options. I've not seen any of this yet, so I don't really know what it looks like. I would be a text message. I'm not sure what they're going to put in a text message. That seems a little strange to me. If you, for some reason, do not have reliable phone or email, make them send it to you in the mail. Absolutely make them send it to you in the mail. And you can pick a language in order to receive that your communication will be received in that language. It's also really important to know that the website in this application process is available in 8 languages, and that includes Spanish. So at the top of the screen, when you log into it, you can pick English, Espanol, and 7 other languages. And once you pick that language, the entire application is in that language. Unfortunately, at this time, if you switch your language partway through your application, it wipes out all of the information before. So if you start your application in English, and now you're on the lease section, and your English is good, but you don't know some of the technical words, right? You don't know what rent regulated means, for example. And now you click Espanol at the top of the screen. It'll translate that page into Spanish, but it'll wipe out all of your information before. So I would really encourage you, if your primary language is Spanish, start the application in Spanish and continue with Spanish throughout to make sure that the platform is stable and that your answers aren't wiped out. We have raised that issue with OTDA and they claim they're working on it, but for now it wipes it out, and that's really disappointing, particularly since so many people communicate in a variety of different languages. Next slide. So after you press send on your application, then you have to upload a bunch of documents, but you can do it as part of the application, but I would not recommend it. On the application itself, I would just enter in your information. I would not use the upload document feature until after you press submit. After you press submit, you'll see that you can then go in and upload documents. Next slide. So you're going to have to prove the identity of everybody in your household. You're going to have to, which is any government issued ID. I'll talk about different things on the next page. Residency, meaning your lease, that you live there, some proof that you live there. What do you do if you don't have a lease? That's okay. You can get a statement from yourself saying, I've lived here since whatever time it is. Get a statement from your neighbor saying, I know Jack lives next door. We've been living next door to each other for 20 years. And get a piece of your mail that's addressed to you. That you can also use as evidence. You'll need the rent amount. You'll need income for each adult household member. And again, you'll need proof of utility arrears for people in your household. You will upload that into the system, and you can use, again, the Con Ed summary statement bill for that. So you're going to be asked to provide, but you do not have to verify your date of birth, your social security number, or your email. Now you're going to get an email verification, but you don't have to provide a piece of paper demonstrating that that's your email address. You're also going to be asked for those arrears month by month, but you don't necessarily have to verify them, although you absolutely can and should upload a rent breakdown if you have one as one of the tenant documents at the end. Next slide. So these are some of the accepted identity documents. Any photo ID of any kind, a driver's license, non-driver's license, government ID. It can be your passport, birth certificate, consular ID, your passport, US or otherwise, your EBT card, a birth or baptismal certificate, school registration, government ID of any kind. Next slide. So again, for income, remember you have a choice about whether you're going to prove your current income as of today, meaning the past month that you've had of income, or you can prove your income from your tax return in 2020. If you're going to prove your current monthly income, then you're going to have to get pay stubs or a letter from the employer, some piece of paper that demonstrates where the income is coming from. Now, if you work for an employer that's not so good at paying you on the books, for example, you could get just a letter from the employer saying, I pay Jack $300 every week, right? That would be fine. Ideally, it'd be on some sort of company letterhead, but some proof that that's what you've been earning from them. If your employer is really not going to help you, then you're going to have to get somewhat creative here. If you, for example, if I waited tables for 100 years and I didn't always get paid by paycheck, but I would always deposit $150 worth of my tips every week in my bank account, right? So if I can show that I've deposited $150 to $200 every week for the past 6 months, and my employer's not giving me a letter, I can say, look, I've been making $150 to $200 a week. So you can get creative with that. If you're self-employed, then you have to pull in some of those self-employment records. That includes Uber, which you may have to do by declaration, but you can usually get something from the Uber driver or from the Uber corporate, and a child support order if you're receiving child support. Next slide. Well, I could go on, but I won't. So I'd be happy to answer any questions, or I don't know if Pallante wants to say something.
We can go into questions.
Sure. Yeah, we have a few that came in as you were giving your presentation. One of the first statement, hello, thank you for this forum. Our building management has stated that because we are subsidized housing, we are not eligible and are refusing to assist residents. Thank you so much. Follow-up question. We were told that if you're Section 8 lost your employment but didn't notify management within 14 days, you are ineligible for arrears.
Wow, there's a lot to unpack there. So the landlord's wrong. I guess in a nutshell, landlord's wrong. It is incorrect that you're ineligible for ERAP if you live in subsidized housing. Subsidized housing means housing that's tied to a certain percentage of your income. The rent is set to a certain percentage of your income. So most traditionally, that's Section 8 or it's NYCHA, right? As I said in the thing, it doesn't mean you're ineligible for ERAP. That is not true. What it does mean is that you're a lower priority for on the approval scale, right? So it could be that there's enough money that everybody who applies gets some money. That is an absolute possibility. There's also additional money that may be coming down the pipeline. So 1,000% apply for it. I don't care what the landlord says. The landlord is supposed to cooperate after you file the application. If the landlord does not cooperate on its side of the portal, then that's not on you, that's on the landlord, right? You may have a defense in a housing case if the landlord brings something against you saying that my application was denied because my landlord never followed through. That may be a defense in a future housing case. But regardless, it's wrong. As far as the 14 days, there are complicated and hateful rules about when you have to report changes in household income when you live in NYCHA or Section 8. But I don't know of anything in the ERAP legislation that forbids arrears for somebody who didn't accurately and timely report their income to NYCHA or Section 8 or anything else. That's bollocks. It's not true.
And thank you. And I believe Somara has her hand raised. So I'll just encourage Somara to post your question in our chat or in our Q&A, and I'll go on to the next question. If a person received assistance through the rent relief program in 2020, can I still apply?
Absolutely, yes. The rent relief program was not a big success, although I'm glad for everybody who got help from them. Congratulations. They are not mutually exclusive. You can and absolutely should. Again, if you only learn one thing today, it's apply for ERAP. You can always be denied, but apply for it. By all means, yes.
What does self-certified income mean? How do I prove this?
So self-certified income is sort of like what I've been discussing. So it's when you either work for yourself or your employer shady or for some reason isn't paying you with a regular paycheck or by check or some official means. So self-certify means you provide an attestation, which is just a statement saying that what you're saying is true about your income. So you can say, you have to say you don't have enough evidence, that there's no other proof available, and that your income is whatever it is. So it's an option. The problem with just using attestation of income as the only proof is that it limits the amount of arrears that you can get to. I believe it's 3 months. So if you can use any other creative way to demonstrate your income, I think you then have an argument to say, you know what, Otada, yes, I did provide an attestation, but I also provided you with a letter from my friend I work with who says that they get paid $200 a week just like me, and they work for this employer and they don't do anything. Here's a letter I prepared for my employer saying that I make $400 a week and they refuse to sign it. I deposit, like I said, $200 every week in my bank account, and that's from employment. How else would I be doing that? So if the absolute only thing you have is an attestation or a statement from yourself saying, I earn $200 a week, then that's what you have and that's fine. But it will limit the amount of arrears that you will be able to get.
Does Pallante complete applications for tenants?
Yes, we do. So we're currently doing the applications. So if you would like us to assist you, you can call us at 212-491-2541. And then once you call us, we will, run down the list of all the required documents and basically just give you all the information that you need to know so that when you come here, it could be done in one setting and you don't have to come back. So we will make sure we give everyone information. So yeah, just call us and we will get you an appointment probably in the next 2 days, very quickly. So yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
What documents are you asking them to bring in? Anything different than what I explained?
No, the exact same. The required documents. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Hi, my husband and I had back owed rent in March 2020. My husband was receiving unemployment. When I received my tax return, I paid the owed rent. Do we still qualify?
You still qualify if you owe rent since March 13th, 2020. So if you paid everything and you don't owe anything now, then you would not be eligible. But if you haven't paid, say, June rent, then you would be eligible, right? Because it's any rent due after March 13th, 2020, and ERAP will pay up to 12 months of that.
What if I don't have a social security number? Can I still apply?
1,000 billion% yes, please, please, please. So there is so much confusion because we all know HRA's usual way of telling you, hey, go away, you're not eligible, is you don't have a social security number. Now that's not even correct for HRA, and that's a whole different webinar. But for this particular application, any immigration status, including somebody who's purely undocumented, who crossed into the United States and has been living their life here, is eligible for ERAP. You don't need any immigration status of any kind, including no immigration status, is all that matters. If you have a social security number, then you need to provide it. But if you do not have a social security number, you leave it blank. And that's true for any member of your household. Can I guarantee that nothing is going to happen? I can't. But I can't guarantee that the moon isn't going to crash on me today. The state is not sharing this information. It's just taking in this information and using it for this purpose. And in fact, the legislation itself limits the use of this, the information they get from ERAP to this ERAP application. So by their own rules, they're not allowed really to share it with anybody else. So yes, no social security number, apply. Yes, please, please, please.
And a request to have that phone number repeated, or so I can put that in the chat.
Ooh.
I think Pallante.
Oh, okay. 212-491-2541. Or you can email us at pallante@pallanteharlem.org.
If I apply after June 30th, do I have a higher chance of not getting the rent money?
We don't know the official answer to that right now, but it's theoretically possible. So yes, the first 30 days, they have to follow certain priorities and give the money out based on that priority. If there is $0 left over at the end of June 30th, then it's possible you wouldn't get any money after that as a result. I don't think that's likely to occur, but it's certainly possible. After June 30th, they will review applications on a rolling basis, meaning you sent it to them, they make a decision based on the day they receive a completed application. Where I think that would differ again is for people who have Section 8 or NYCHA. They would just hold those applications for some period of time. But yes, you should absolutely be fine. I wouldn't, if you can apply before the end of June, please do. But I don't think the money's going to run out at the end of June.
Buenas tardes. Yo quería saber qué papeles tiene que mandar el landlord a ERAP. Gracias.
Good question. So the landlord's going to need to provide proof that they've received rent from you in the past of some kind, meaning some sort of payment history of some kind. They're going to have to give their checking account information because the money's sent to them directly. If the landlord asks, none of that information goes to the tenant or to any advocate. It's only between the state and them. None of us ever sees it. I know they have a lot of concern. I don't care to know any landlord's account numbers. None of us will ever learn them. They're safe. They're going to have to provide a certification. It's like a certified rent breakdown, more or less, where they have to affirm that the amount of rent owed is accurate on a month-by-month basis. They're going to have to prove that they own that particular building and unit. That's really it. The sticking point is going to be that many of them don't want to do anything, right? And then landlords are going to have to agree to certain terms as a result of receiving ERAP funds. So that means that the landlord's going to have to agree that it will not raise the rent for at least 1 year, and that it will not evict you for non-payment of rent for the next year, and that it will not evict you for coming to the end of your lease for the next year. So the landlord has to send in those forms, complete some information on its screen, including the certification or agreement of those terms that I just described. As I talked a little bit about before, I'm not sure what Jakari or anyone else has seen thus far. So most landlords are fine, right? If you're going to get $15,000 to $20,000, they say yes. There are many landlords who feel a lot of feelings that are not love and light. I don't know what's going to happen right now, but the legislation says that the landlord should be cooperating, and that failure to cooperate can create a defense for that tenant in a future housing court case. So a year from now, you could come in and show the denial, explain the landlord never bothered to respond or do anything on their part. Your advocate asked them to do it, they didn't do it. You asked them to do it, they didn't do it. And that may be able to have a defense for you in that case, saying, not only do I not owe that rent, but the landlord's given up its right to get that rent because they wouldn't even bother to agree to ERAP.
¿Cuál es la última fecha para aplicar?
There's not a final date to apply except for possibly September 30th, 2022, but it's open until the money is exhausted, which is supposed to occur on or before September 30th of next year.
Can I apply if receiving a rent subsidy? Would they pay my full rent or a portion?
Excellent question, and one I'm thrilled you asked. So if you have a rent subsidy like FEPS or city FEPS, you absolutely can and should apply for ERAP. The way it should work is that ERAP will cover the arrears and up to the 12 months, right? And then city FEPS or FEPS will pay the balance in addition to the ongoing subsidy. Absolutely, yes. And right now, HRA is essentially denying every one-shot deal application because it's requiring people first to apply for ERAP and then be denied or be approved, and then you can go back to HRA and apply for the one-shot deal. So many people are accustomed to just applying for a one-shot deal first, but I would not do that at this point. It'll just result in frustration for you. But with the FEPS application, they're supposed to accept it now, and they're going to keep it in pending status, meaning they're going to hold it until there's a decision on the ERAP application, and then they'll make a decision on the FEPS. With city FEPS, home base is being told to do everything except submit the city FEPS application, right? So if you're applying for city FEPS for the first time, for example, they have to do an inspection usually. They have to do a whole bunch of owner verification here and there. All of those processes should still be occurring now. The only thing that will be held back is the actual application. But yes, ERAP should work hand in hand with rent subsidies, absolutely.
So I think that's the end of the questions for tonight. Thank you, Jack, of the Bronx Legal Aid Society, for being here tonight and being so insightful and taking the time to answer all of our attendees' questions. And we do appreciate you and appreciate your time. Like Jack said, the takeaway for tonight is for everyone to apply if you owe. This is money that you don't have to pay back. So please use this resource and apply. And if you need assistance, once again, you can contact us. We're open Monday through Friday, 10:30 to 7 p.m. Thank you, Jack, again. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Robert. And thank you to all our attendees for staying here tonight. We had a nice crowd tonight. So if you could just answer this poll, and just so we can know, how the webinar went for you tonight, how you enjoyed it, it would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely let us know about your, thank you so much. And always great to know if you're listening.